So in this video we're going to have a look at how you use the for loop in JavaScript and also how you can use the for loop to loop through a set of items on a page called a collection. So for loop just behave like a for loop that you might have encountered in Visual Basic or Python, for example, but the difference with the web page is that you can't just print stuff. You need to pick somewhere on the page to actually put it. So I've got two examples that I'm going to show you here. Firstly, times tables. So what we're going to do here is we're going to generate a times table. We're going to ask the user for a number, but instead of using input asking for input from the console, we're going to just take the number from an input box on the page. So we've got an input box. It's a text type, which is the kind of original type of text box to put on a page, on a form. And I've also got an input button. So I'm just going to actually put that on the next line. Normally I would do that in one line, but so you can see it more easily, I'll have it there. And so that's a type button, and the value for button is what it says on it. And I've also got a heading, H1, and finally I've got a div because we need somewhere to put the results. So I've put a div at the bottom, and we can use the inner HTML property of that to actually display the results. So the first thing we need to do is think about how we're going to do this. So you can repeatedly update the div as you go around the loop. So you can calculate the first calculation in the times table, add that to the div, do the next one, add that. I don't know how that would compare in terms of efficiency, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to build up a string containing the times table, and then I'm going to write it in one go to that div at the end. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a string variable, although they're untyped, but I'll set it to be a string. So it needs a name, obviously, so let's just call it output. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a for loop. So I'm going to have for, and how for works in JavaScript, it's a standard C style for loop, but it's if you're coming from other languages, it's a bit more like a while, really. So you have a variable, which is your counter, and because I haven't used n previously, I'm going to declare it with var. But if you have previously declared it, you can just set n equal to 0 at the first stage. So there's 3 bits inside the brackets. There's this initial value of the counter. So this is a counter-controlled loop. Then an upper limit. So in this case, I'm going to say n is less than or equal to 12. So you can see here how it's a bit like a while loop. So it's starting at 0 and it's going to continue while n is less than or equal to 12. And then the third part is the step size. So I'm just going to increase my value of n by 1. So n++ is the standard C style notation for incrementing a value by 1. There's also minus minus. And if you want to look into it as well, you can do ++n, and that increases the value before it uses it. So you need to be a little bit careful in loops with things like that. So the bit that's repeated in a loop goes inside curly brackets. So I've got curly brackets. So if you're new to JavaScript, you will find it a bit curly bracket-tastic, but you'll soon get used to it. Also, you need to remember to put semicolons at the end of lines. So actually, one thing I'm going to do, you can, in your program, refer to the contents of text boxes, the values of certain items in line, but because I'm going to repeat the reference to the number in that box, I'm going to set it to a variable. So I'm going to say var t equals document dot get element by ID, and it's called table number. So table number, and what I want from that, so that's the element, and what I want from that is the value. So you could do that every time you go around, but that's going to make the line of the code a little bit longer. So what I'm going to do is each time I go around my loop, so 0 to 12, just for the different rows of the times table, I'm going to say output plus equals, which you can do, behaves in the same way as plus equals in lots of other languages. So it adds to the existing value, or in this case concatenates onto the end of the existing value. What we want is n. So that'll be the number, and then we'll have a times, and then the table we're doing, and then an equal sign, and then the actual calculation. So it's going to be n times t. So the first time around it's going to be 0 times whatever you put in the box equals, and then whatever calculation you do, and it's not, in fact it's not y, is it? It's t. And then, because it's an output onto a web page, you might need some HTML to format it. So if I keep concatenating, it's all going to be on the same line. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in a I'll use a BR tag. You could put the whole thing in a paragraph, but depending on your line spacing, etc., that might space them out a bit too much. So I'm going to do that. So that builds up each row of the times table, and then I'm going to output that. So where am I going to put that? I'm going to put that in here. So I'm going to say document.get element by ID table display. And what property of that we're going to change? We're going to change inner HTML, and we're going to set it equal to output. So we're going to put our string input, which we've built up by concatenating, into that div. The only other thing is how are we going to trigger this? So if I just run this, well, let's run it straight off. So I'm just going to save that. I've switched to Firefox now for the videos because actually, after I recommended the JavaScript error notifier, it stops working in Edge and Chrome, but it is still working in Firefox. So I'm going to switch to Firefox so we can see the errors. So if I run that, you can see it doesn't like it, and that's probably for the reason that I mentioned in the first video, which is I'm referring to something which possibly has yet to be rendered. So if it runs this as soon as it appears, then that's not going to work, is it? So what I need to do is some way of triggering this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this into a function. So I'm going to say function, and let's call it display. And we need to wrap it up there. And then we need some way of triggering this function. So here on the button, we'll say on click equals display. So we'll get the click event of the button to run my JavaScript function called display. And if we run that now, so it won't run because it's in a function. It'll define the function, but it won't run it at this point, and it'll only run it when I click the button further down. So back to here. There we go. So if I put in a number here, 2, I'll get my 2 times table. And if I put in 3, I get my 3 times table. So it's working. Notice how kind of instantaneously that appears. So it's pretty fast JavaScript, and in fact if you compare it, if you have a look at the Sudoku solving program on my website, there's a Python version and a JavaScript version, and on my computer the JavaScript version is about 40 times faster. It really is that much quicker. So you might think that kind of leaping through elements on a page you'll see the delay, but you don't. Yep, so that's working. What might improve this? Well, what about if I put in like A? Notice it doesn't generate an error like Visual Basic or Python might, but it just gives me the wrong answer in the same way that an Excel spreadsheet might, for example. So we can trap that. There's a JavaScript function called isNaN. So if you go back to here, so you could say something like, when each time you run it, you could say if isNaN t. Well, we haven't declared t at this point, so it should be further down really. So we could check whether t is a number before we proceed. However, as we said in the last video, when you're if you want some animation, you can rely on CSS transition effects and things. For validation, you can actually rely on form features of HTML. So what I could do, if I only want a number in there, instead of using a text field, now text input boxes were the first thing. So back in the day, 25 years ago when I first used JavaScript, that's pretty much all there was. With HTML5, I think, they introduced several other types, so date, where it pops up a little calendar, and number. they've introduced. So if I say, if I say number, that gives me some extra properties. So I can say min equals 0, max equals 12. No, it still says 23, 12, and save that. So now, if we go back here and if I refresh that, we can see we've got radio buttons. So I can only go up, spin buttons. I can only go up as far as 12. I can only go down as far as 0. And if I try and type a letter, oh, that's interesting. Now, one of the things you might encounter is that it does say please enter a number. They behave in different ways in different browsers. So I don't use Firefox much. In Chrome and Edge, it won't let you enter that in the first place. So what happens if I do? Okay. So slightly different error this time. So it does behave differently. So I've not encountered that in Firefox before. I should have checked that before I made the video. But you can that will help you out a little bit, won't it? So using number. So you can use some of the features of HTML to validate. It's a bit of a faff having to change the number and click as well. So one of the other things we said we could do was we could we looked at this in the last video. We can use different events to trigger the same function. So we can on here we could say on input equals. So this is on the number input. We can say display. And so that runs the same thing, so I don't need any extra code. I'm just running the function from a different place. So now if I go back to Firefox and refresh the page, if I change the number, it updates the table as well. So I can update it in two ways. So that's a kind of loop to do the sort of thing that you might do in a traditional programming language. I'm not saying you don't want to do that, but probably a more common use is what we're about to do next. But obviously some calculations in the background are going to require repetition. So if you want to calculate whether the number that the user's input is a prime number or something like that, there's going to be some calculation going on. So let's have a look at another example. This is probably something, if you want to make an interactive web page, this is probably something that you're more likely to want to do. So I've made another example, and here it is. So what I've done so far is I've created a div, and I've just copied and pasted it. So there's 9 of those divs, and they've got the class called light, because they're all the same. So if you haven't watched the previous video on classes and IDs, have a look at that. And then I've put a button on which does run my change function, and I've already put the change function in here. And so I've styled the light, I've made it 10% of the viewport width with a border radius of 50%, which rounds it off, and I've put a border on so you can see where it is. Now notice if I do that, they all appear in a vertical column, and that might be what you want. But one of the properties we didn't really look at is something called display. So there's 2 types of HTML element. There's one that's inline, and that means you can have those in a row. So like strong or italic, you can have those inside other things. So you can have a bold word inside a paragraph. The other type is block. So a block element always starts a new row. So a paragraph, for example, is a block element, and so is a heading. And divs are a block element by default, but you can override that with CSS. So I'm going to say display inline block. And again, these take a little bit of getting used to. I can't go through everything in CSS, but that means behave like a block in some ways, but allow them to appear on the same line as each other. So now they will wrap like words do, for example. Notice also that although there's 9 of them and I've made them 10% across, there's too many to fit on the page. So if we have a look at in the actual browser, they are okay to begin with, but if I resize that at a certain point, they probably will get too big. There we go. And the reason for that is there's a default margin on a browser, and it might be different from another browser. So as I said, I don't use Firefox much, but sometimes you find that things look different in different browsers, and it's because of things like different default margins. So even if you think you don't want one, set it to 0 maybe, or whatever you want, so it behaves the same in every browser to override the default. Right, so I've got my got the things on here. I'm going to treat these. I'm going to light these up. So imagine these are like Christmas lights or something, so not very sophisticated. So I've already created an array. That's an array of HTML, valid HTML colors. So I've used the wordy ones, but you could use the codes as well. And what I've also done is I've used this. So light is just a variable name, but I called it light because they're lights. Whether you go for plural or singular is obviously a matter of style. Some people go for lights because there's going to be more than one of them. I like to use light because I think it sounds better when you put a number in there. So light 1, light 2. So your choice. So what I've done here is at the start of the video we used get element by ID to get the value of the number in the text box and also to write stuff to the div, and that's because I'd named those with IDs, and IDs must be unique. However, they have a class, and classes don't have to be unique. There's 9 of these. So what I'm going to get when I get things by class name, even if there is only one of them, is what we call a collection. And a collection is effectively an array. So what this will do is it will collect up, or it will give me a collection, a set of all the things on the page that have that class. So and then I can use it like an array. So what I can do is I can kind of loop through this. So I can say things like, I can say same as last time for var n equals 0. Then when we're going to stop, or how are we going to continue, or under what conditions we're going to continue. So while n is less than. Now, so there's 9 things in the list there, so it's going to be a collection or an array of 9 items, but they're numbered 0 to 8. So I don't want to go up to 9, so it needs to be less than. And there's a method, an attribute, a property called length. So if you're coming from Python or Basic, that's just like len, light, for example. So how many elements in there? You can also use it with text as well, just as you can do with len in Python. And then again n++. So we're going to loop through one at a time. If you wanted to go every other one, you could just increase n by 2 there. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to, in my loop, I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to say light. So it behaves just like an array. So light n. So each time we go around, this will be a different item in the array. And then we say, well, what property would you want to change? So in the style property, there's a thing called background color. Now, background color, and several other properties in CSS have a hyphen in like that, but in JavaScript we don't use hyphens. What we have is we omit the hyphen and then have a capital letter instead. So if you're not sure what the JavaScript name of an HTML property is, there's plenty of help, W3 Schools, etc. Will help you with that. But generally, take out the hyphen, capitalize the next letter. So we can do something like this. We can say red, for example, and what that will do is that will then make all of these red. So if we have a look at this, so click the button, boom, red. So, and notice you can't really see, it doesn't appear to color one at a time. They all look like they're changing at the same time because JavaScript is pretty fast. And what we can also do is we can do things like this. So instead of saying always red, we could use the position. So we could alternate through the colors here. So we could use the color array. So we could say color, and then we could say n. Well, if we just use n though, it's going up to 8, but there's only 4 numbers in there, so it's going to go off the end. You're going to get a subscript out of range error. So I'm going to use a dab of modular arithmetic to wrap it round. So I'm using 4 here, but I could also use, I could use color.length, so I could add extra colors if I wanted to. So now, if I try that, they're going to be different colors, or they're going to repeat, they're going to cycle through the colors. And then notice that when I click the button, because it's doing the same thing every time, actually it doesn't appear to change. So what I can do is I could do this sort of thing. So if I wanted them to cycle through the colours, I could have a variable called something like offset, and set it to 0 at the start, and then what I could do is I could add that to the value of n, and so that would cycle through the first time. It would have no difference because n plus 0 is the same as n. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say offset plus plus. So after I've finished colouring all the lights, I'm going to add 1 to the value of offset, and that means when I go round again, it'll add 1 to all the numbers. So that will shift them all. And the think about, while the page is displayed, the values of your variables persist. So although it doesn't look like any code is running, offset won't be reset unless you explicitly reset it. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go here. I'm going to refresh that. I'm going to click on change, and if I click change again, they'll cycle through the colours. Now obviously that's quite a stark change. But what we could do is we could use a bit of CSS. So on light we could say transition, all, I don't know, 0.5 seconds ease. And that does apply to JavaScript changes as well. So that's a bit less kind of jarring. I'm sure you could refine that technique if you wanted a particular effect. So that's looping through to kind of change the state of a whole set of things in a collection. So we gather those by class name, and then just the idea that the values of your variables persist all the while that the page is displayed. If I refresh that page, then reset will go back to 0. So that's a couple of uses of for. What you might be thinking now is, well, I don't really want to keep clicking while my lights are illuminated. Can I get that to happen on its own? So automatically? Well, yes you can, and that's what the next videos are going to do. So there's 3 different ways of getting things to appear kind of periodically in JavaScript. So at the start of the next video, I'll describe those 3, and then I will separate them into separate videos so they're not so long. So you can watch the start of the next video, decide which one you want, and then choose the video appropriately.